and sort of catching up with how things are going with him. Just to start off, just to remind you, it's a live show. It'd be lovely to hear from you. We're broadcasting on several platforms at the same time, on Facebook Live, on Periscope, which is Twitter, I believe, and also on YouTube. I've got various sort of members of my team checking out those streams. So if you've got any comments or thoughts you want to share with us, that'd be great. Or you can give me a call on the phone, 07506 319 745. That's +44 and drop the first 0 if you're calling from abroad. And you can come at us through WhatsApp and stuff like that. And it'd be great to sort of hear from you, have a chat with us, or have a chat with Ali. Hi, Ali. Welcome. Good to see you. How are you doing?
It is in Thailand, so yeah, quite early for me, but no worries.
Yeah, what time is it there? What sort of
4 a.m. Yeah,
it's sort of yesterday, as far as I'm concerned. sort of the time travel sort of by Zoom is happening. So welcome on. It's been ages since I've seen you. It's really good to see you again.
Yeah,
last time I saw you, I think, was 3 years ago, I want to say.
2 or 3. We would have been in London. Yeah,
in London. I think I seem to remember we went for a wander around Hyde Park.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, must have been
had a coffee in that cafe by the lake with all the bird shit everywhere.
Yeah,
sort of
back in the day before the chaos began.
It's a different world, isn't it? It's sort of it does feel. I think we were sort of putting the world to rights at that point, and by the looks of it, we didn't do a very good job because of what followed on from all of that, and sort of. So our planning went to pot. How are things over there around the pandemic in Thailand? How's it been going?
Well, difficult to say, really. I mean, it's calm in Thailand. It hasn't really been affected in the same way that everywhere else has, obviously. It's, partly, I suppose, as a result of the government's response to it. But I think mask wearing as well was the factor. It's in the culture, so it's a number of things have led to the fact it wasn't anywhere near as serious as in the West. So we've been kind of cosseted and protected from it. But on the other hand, of course, economically, possibly worse affected than the West because it's so tourist dependent. So it's a bit of both, really, not good, but on the other hand, quite good compared to the rest of the world. So
yeah. And the sort of Asian model, that part of the world, has very much been about closed borders and control movement and all that sort of stuff. So
yes, for sure. Yes, more so. Yeah. So well, hopefully we're all slowly coming out of it.
Is it at the similar sort of phase? Because we're on the way out now. Like this week was a milestone. We're now allowed to socialise with people legally, so which we weren't allowed to do before. Is it similar sort of stage over there? Or
to be fair, it's been like that for a while. As soon as people realised it wasn't happening, they kept the masks on, but they didn't stop doing. We only had one small 2 very short lockdowns right at the beginning, and then just at the beginning of winter, another small one. But other than that, having said that, bars and things are closed, the obvious things, but restaurants aren't, so it's a bit of both. Yeah.
So it's a bit like Australia, really. I was talking to somebody from Australia the other week, and
life
is pretty much going on, but there's just this closing of borders and all of that sort of stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. And how have you been doing personally through it all? How has it affected you?
Well, taking the time out, really. Obviously, like a lot of people in behavioural health field, I've been busy most of my adult life, really. So it was an opportunity to write and things like that, and work on myself a little bit, take time with the family, things like that. So I've just been concentrating on that. I mean, I'm probably bit done with it now, but
done the personal development. Time to do something else now. Time to do the skiing next, please. No, I get it, absolutely. But it's a sort of not been too bad for you then. Sort of, I mean, it's been quite tough in sort of over here in Europe, it's been sort of quite significant impact.
I really feel for everybody in the UK, Europe, America. We've had it very easy here, so I feel quite lucky in that regard. Yeah.
Good to hear. And James is asking me, how do you know Ali? And I said, well, I met him a few years ago because we're in a similar field, which is, you've mentioned behavioural health. And we sort of clicked. I was very interested in some of the ideas that you have around treatment and support for people, which is what we're going to go into sort of a bit. But it was sort of remind me to sort of ask you about you and your personal history, and so that people who don't know you, I take for granted I know who you are and what's going on in your story. So shall we start with that sort of background? Why you ended up in sort of the field that you did, and were you a nurse at some point? I seem to remember you being a nurse or something at some point.
Outreach worker initially. I mean, like a lot of people, obviously, I came into the field, addiction-specific behavioural health field, through my own life experiences, addiction and recovery from addiction. But my first post was as an outreach worker in Haringey, which UK listeners and London listeners in particular will know is at that point in the 2000s, I'd say was a fairly notorious borough in terms of things like social services and health problems. There've been a lot of high profile cases that were extreme poverty related, and history
Victoria, Climbié, and then Ben and stuff like that. Yeah.
Right. Obviously, the most serious riots that have ever occurred in the UK were in Tottenham. And Tottenham was my beat, if you like. And my job was basically to go around and pick up street drinkers and also injecting drug users, etc., and get them literally in from the cold into a day centre, which was harm minimization kind of orientated. It wasn't a 12-step abstinence orientated service, related to the borough's methadone clinics, etc., as well. And then if possible, get them into treatment. So that's how I first, other than my own experience, that's how I started working also with rehabs.
Did you identify with their experience? Was that similar to your own experience?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say right at the far end of the continuum. We know that substance use disorder is a continuum. It's not a black and white thing. Alcohol addiction and drug addiction, if you want to call them that, are not black or white. You're not one or either you are one or you aren't one. It's not like that. There's a continuum. So I wouldn't say I was right at the far end, but I was getting there. And so, yeah, I was definitely the man for the job. It wasn't a job other people wanted to do. Even people who had sort of social work experience, etc., were not happy to do that job. So I was in my early 30s at that point. I was probably 3 or 4 years into recovery. I'd never worked, obviously, in my addiction. So that was the whole of my teens and 20s were spent in a misspent youth, basically. So there I was, sort of early 30s, starting out in the field. And as they say, some people's lack of desire is another person's opportunity. So, it was obviously not a popular job. It was a tough job, but I loved it. And
what did you like about it, Ali? What did you get out of it?
Well, I'd be out and about in the borough. I'd be meeting people in the community. I liked communicating. I'd say that's probably my number one skill. So I've sort of obviously transferred that now into writing and speaking as well. Having gone on to then run rehabs and so on and have to represent them in media and things like that. It's always been, my skill has always been communication. Well, it's no different on the street. You have to communicate properly, otherwise you get yourself into trouble in those kinds of places. So I think I like the challenge. I do like, I suppose, a little bit of danger. It's
right.
I'm quite okay with that. And seeing people get clean and sober. In that particular scenario, it would be something like 1%.
Yes.
So it was a revolving door, very tough. But that didn't really, if I'm honest, that didn't dim my enthusiasm. And friends and relatives who weren't in the field used to say to me, "Don't you find it disheartening?" And I never understood that question. I just did not understand it, and I had a rather, perhaps rather harsh sounding analogy that I used to use. It's kind of like precious stone mining. You know, a lot of rock and a lot of rubble out, and occasionally you get a gem. And I know that sounds horrible, but the reality is horrible, you know, and I'm looking for that gem.
Oddly enough, it doesn't sound horrible to me. I'm not sure why it would sound horrible to people. I get it.
Yeah,
you know, if you can save one person,
yes,
that's great. That's a real success, isn't it? So
save one person, save the world. I think that's a Jewish saying. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot of truth in that, and it's interesting. I wonder if it's sort of because I'm, you know, work in psychological therapies, I'm interested in sort of people and their motivations and their sort of reasons for doing things. So that's why I'm asking the questions. It's a sort of unfortunate sort of habit I've got over the years from my profession, sort of being intrusive and personal, and all that sort of stuff. And but it's interesting, I think, that sense in which you viewed very much the positive side of things rather than the negative side of things. So you were looking for the diamond as opposed to all the shit that was going on. Is that you? Is that you, do you think, as a person? Is that the way you are?
Yes. Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. Although my wife might beg to differ. And, apparently I can be quite negative sometimes, and like a lot of people, you know, and I only do it with her, and it's another thing, isn't it? We're personaed up to some extent when we're out and about in public, and that's normal. I mean, it'd be pretty strange if people weren't like that. If you can imagine a policeman just letting it all spill out, you know, it's not, or a teacher, you know, we are personas and we're real people, and so I'm not, I can be very negative, but I try to pull that back when I'm out and about doing my thing, as I should. And when I'm in my work, I'm looking for the positive. You have to do that. Obviously, when you're working with addiction, you're dealing with, I mean, I was reading back through M. Scott Peck the other day. And it's a bit of an old model, classic self-help book, Road Less Traveled. It's a bit of an old psychological model now, but he kind of divided people with mental and emotional health disorders into neurotics and otherwise. And neurotics could be helped because they knew they had a problem. And the personality disorders couldn't be helped because they didn't know they had a problem. Well, you're dealing with a lot of personality disorders, obviously, in addiction treatment. And so it is tough. You know, you're going up against a lot of resistance and so on. So if that affects you, then you're going to have a hard career. That's all I would say.
Well, addiction is often seen as a personality disorder when it comes down to it.
Yes.
Freud believed that alcoholics were personality disordered and therefore could not be treated, etc. And there's quite a lot of people think that as well. And there's evidence that it's true. It's sort of, you know.
Preface that with Freud was kind of pre-12-step movement. I suppose the 12-step pioneers, Bill W. and Dr. Bob, that founded Alcoholics Anonymous, kind of found that not to be true, and they kind of cracked it in some sense, didn't they? And they have terminology like, you know, there are people who are fundamentally dishonest, and I think they were talking about personality disorders or severe ones who can't be helped, but everybody else can, even if they've got grave mental and emotional health problems. They actually use that word. So people who are chronically depressed or something like that, you can be helped if you've got just a little capacity to be honest with self. So they kind of answered that, I think, you know.
Yeah, to some extent, but also I think there's a lot of things they didn't answer, such as ADHD, autism, etc. Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that why programs like that don't work. And there's about 12% of the population that are actively damaged by groups anyway. So that's got nothing to do with their honesty or dishonesty. I mean, personality disorders technically are a very small part of the population, 1%, but it depends how you define it. And I'm thinking more about that definition of PD, which is around attachment issues and relationship issues, which I think is core in addiction. But we'll get on to that. I'm more interested in you at the moment rather than us going off on a nice intellectual debate about the meaning of addiction and treatment. I guess one of the things, what I identify with, and I'm talking about myself here, in that searching for the diamond and the way out, and some sense, for me, this was true, I don't know about for you, but some sense of right and wrong, justice, and those types of issues. And sort of, I've always been attracted to fights around the underdog and lost causes to some extent, and very much a fighter for rights of people who are disenfranchised. And I think I got that a lot from my early family culture. A number of things. One, you know, I come from Irish culture where that's part of it, that sort of narrative is part of it, but also because of the sort of abuse and stuff like that. And it's very prototypical of somebody who may have experienced childhood abuse, so they have a strong sense of right and wrong and want to engage with that. Were there similar types of things for you or not, or was it you were a different route into that?
No, yeah, it was perhaps not the typical. I mean, my father was in the RAF.
Right.
He was a complex man, and my mother was actually in the RAF as well, and he left obviously before having me, and they divorced when I was quite young, probably 2 or 3 years old. And my dad they were very unalike. So my father was very, very working class guy. Yeah. And my mum was more aspirational, very well read, self-taught. Both of them came from poor backgrounds. So that my mother was a miner's daughter from South Yorkshire, and my dad was from Tyneside, from actually a very poverty-stricken background in Tyneside. And he'd gotten out. He'd done quite well in the sense of I mean, in the 50s and 60s, it was the route out of the north of England for a lot of young people, was to join the services, and you know, particularly RAF, and so he'd done okay, but they parted in their 20s, put it that way, as people tend to do. And she was much more cerebral, my mother, and my dad was definitely not cerebral. You know, I mean, when he left the forces, he was white van man. You know, that was my dad, and he's great in many ways. He was a keen sportsman, but he drank about as much as you could get away with. That's how I would describe my dad's drinking. He wasn't an alcoholic, but he drank about as much as he could get away with. And on occasion, that did flare up, you know, and I remember some fairly unpleasant scenes with my stepmother's family, for example. So it's there in our family, that gene, if you like, or that culture. Probably, you know, both the drinking culture. My mother's father was obviously a miner, and you know, ardent Marxist, and quite angry, I gather. I only just remember him, but he was a very, very big drinker. I mean, as I get onto with chronic non-communicable diseases and things like that, he smoked heavily, as did all of my father's family. I mean, my father's mother smoked about, people think I'm lying when I say this, about 80 a day.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you imagine a poverty-stricken kind of old grandma in Newcastle, and she'd had this horrible habit of putting her cigarettes out with her finger and dropping them in a bread bag that she carried around with.
That's right. I remember those days. It's revolting, absolutely, yeah.
So it's not exactly, you know, a high-class background, but certainly not ghetto poor either. And because I was an only child, I actually grew up north of London, in Norfolk, in North Norfolk, which is quite isolated. I grew up in a market town called Fakenham, which is different to other North Norfolk towns. North Norfolk's a bit chic now, you know, it's a sort of London getaway, but Fakenham wasn't that kind of town. Fakenham was a factory town. It had print works. All of the old Cox and Wyman Penguin paperbacks were printed in Fakenham. Lots of imports from Luton and London and so on. It was actually, in a way, quite a rough town. And that's how I grew up, very macho culture. My early experiences were unpleasant. You know, I was, I think, probably quite sensitive and artistic. That's something you have to dig quite hard to find in me now, but it's still there. But it got kind of beaten out of me in some way. So I had no choice but to toughen up. And that's something I was definitely capable of. And that's what I did. So that later it was a job, my work was to go back and kind of unravel that and allow, whilst not becoming necessarily softer, because my life has continued to be quite challenging, but at the same time allowing out that legitimate part of myself that is more cerebral, was my mother's side, more artistic, etc. So that was my background. Typical kid in the 80s from working class or lower middle class family, single parent, and my mum had a tough time.
Was that also the same time when you were interested or developed your interest that you have in your own body and somatic work and building yourself up? Did that come early as well, or was that a later sort of thing?
That was a natural thing. I was always a sport, and I always liked martial arts and things like that. All we had in our town was judo. I did that avidly.
Yeah.
And I was obviously into football to a relatively high level and all of those things. So that was something that I just did. I'm like my dad like that, even though he was a very big drinker and so on. And when he was young, a very heavy smoker, but he, right up until his death, would run 3 or 4 miles every single day of his life, 100 push-ups and 200 sit-ups. If he didn't do that, he would go crazy. And I'm exactly the same. I'm not just a sitting down cerebral person. If I don't get physical activity, I start to get bent out of shape. It's just my way. And I think some people are like that, and it might answer a lot of problems, especially in young men, which again, I'm sure we'll come on to.
Yeah.
As they're doing too much sitting around, too much sedentary.
I tell you what, it's sad that, for quite some time, they've come back now, but certainly in the bit of London I'm in, which is sort of North End, East London, there used to be a lot of boxing clubs for kids and things like that, young men in particular, which went out of favour for a while. They've come back now, which I think is brilliant, because I think, and let's talk about this and talk about some of the work that you did, because it's a nice point to go, because my experience as a youth worker and working in places like Hoxton, which is now very gentrified and has become called something else, but in those days when I was down there, it wasn't. I was working in the arts, but we also worked very closely with these boxing clubs and things like that, working with young men who were angry, traumatized, disenfranchised, misunderstood, and the army wasn't an option anymore, because the army stopped being an option. It's become quite a select thing now, the army. It's no longer that route out of the sort of situation that you're talking about. So you, unlike a lot of people who worked in addiction treatment, very much went into the use of these types of mechanisms in terms of somatic approaches, physical exercise, boxing, Muay Thai. Can you tell me about that, Ali? Your sort of what inspired you? And
it actually did start in Tottenham before I left for Thailand. We'll get into, I guess. So I had started doing a powerlifting club for this is hilarious, for street homeless guys. Yeah. So we did powerlifting, and we also did sort of endurance stuff. So we'd use Finsbury Park for doing endless circuits on the bike. And then I got them to kind of raise money. So they had two aspects. They had the physical aspect, which was fairly extreme. Yeah. We'd abseiling down the front of fire stations in Finsbury Park and Stoke Newington and places like that. Yeah. And then be raising money for like kids. So they get the rare chance to be a hero, because this is the thing, is guys that are in that situation. They part of the reason why they got so many problems, because they're not doing anything for anybody else. They can't, they're struggling to do something for themselves. So it started there, and I realized that worked. I knew it worked for me, and lo and behold, it worked for them. So then, to cut a long story short, I left England in 2009, 2010, went to Thailand and started a private rehab called The Cabin. You probably had, spoken about that on this show before. It was turned out to be the largest rehab in the Asia Pacific region. So a completely different end of the scale, private treatment. And I was obviously one of the founders and shareholders. So I went from being an employee in the public sector in London, working with to being the director of a private company in Asia, the biggest treatment provider in Asia. So it was a very large private company treating hundreds of people residentially, right at the other end of the scale. So there we would have, fairly affluent people from the Western Australian mining industries, headmasters from Hong Kong or somewhere, business people, celebrities, the lot. So everybody that you can think of. But I applied the same thing there. What we did get was a lot of young men, particularly from Australia, but also from Singapore, sort of Chinese ethnicity. It was a wonderful melting pot, actually, where we had young men from all sorts of cultures, what you might call a sort of predominantly Anglo-Saxon culture, and then predominantly Chinese cultures. All the same problems: smoking lots of meth, gaming's in there a lot, sex addiction, everything. Oftentimes, even though they are middle class and affluent parents, they're involved in crime anyway, and so on. So there we used what was around us, which was Muay Thai, Thai boxing, and triathlon training, so the guys could sort of pick which one suited them best. If they weren't adversarial by nature, then they could do the triathlon, which is equally a test. Obviously, you're fighting against yourself mostly with triathlon, especially in that heat. So that worked in combo with the usual therapies like CBT, 12 steps, and so on. I found that somatic experiencing, which for your listeners is getting into your body. So the more that we've understood that addiction is kind of trauma related, there's often something there, usually what we might call small t traumas. So it's not necessarily PTSD, but people are sort of hyper vigilant in a slightly traumatized state because they've had adverse life experiences. So what therapists have done, obviously, this, over the decades, is they've worked out it's not all about talking. There's top-down treatment and there's bottom-up treatment. That's right. Down is using your head, rational arguments. Let's do some counseling. Let's listen. Let's hear you talk about your feelings. That doesn't work sometimes. The way that adversity and especially trauma works on us is through our nervous system. So we are all emotional brain. We're all limbic brain when we're in that place. And so what are the things that ramp down and calm down the nervous system is what you want to be talking about. And traditionally, we've known that is things like meditation and yoga. So there's a whole raft of therapies now that they call somatic experiencing. Guess what? It's ancient. We don't need the new models. We've already got them. They're called meditation, asana, yoga, these things that humans have known for centuries calm down the nervous system. But we added to that some things that aren't traditionally that calming.
Which is, for me, the interesting thing, because I was working with an organization called Kids Company that sort of folded some years ago. But the actual work itself, I thought, there was some really good stuff going on. One of the things that we used to do with our kids, particularly the young men, was teach them kickboxing. And people were just horrified. Why on earth would you teach these violent kids how to be organized in their violence? Actually, it didn't work that way. The way it worked was it taught them how to regulate their emotions through a physical practice. And there's a neurological basis for it, which is the back brain, when it's too active, will overwrite the front brain, which is the cognitive talking bit. But if you can work with that back brain and the limbic system, the midbrain, through physical activity, which is how you work with it, you can then enhance your capacity to work with the front brain, and you can calm down the overactive nervous systems. So there's plenty of evidence that shows that, and nowhere. And I remember, and I don't know if you remember this, but one of the things that attracted me to doing kung fu as a kid was I felt so angry, and I was really sort of impressed by these guys who knew how to kill you with a little finger, as so I thought, but actually were really, really cool and controlled about stuff. And they never lost their tempers. Maybe they did, but they never did in front of us kids. And I always found that really impressive, seeing men who were strong and who were fit and who could be very violent if they wanted to be, choose not to be. And that, I was intrigued. How do you choose not to be? How do you choose not to lose your temper?
Well, it's sublimation, to use a Freudian concept. It really is that simple. So a very simple way of explaining it that everybody will understand is, people think Freud's complex, and he is, but a very, very simple way of understanding Freud's concept of sublimation is he wasn't just all about sex. He was mostly about sex, but he was also about aggression. So he thought sex and aggression were the two predominant forces. And what we've just said about the hindbrain, that is true. We are a rapacious primate species. So sublimation was taking those drives and not getting rid of them. It did not involve, it is impossible to get rid of them. And yet we live in a civilized society, so-called, where that is not acceptable to be, it's in general not acceptable to be very aggressive or very sexual. So what Freud's theory obviously was that we become repressed because we have to ramp that down. But there's another way of doing it, which is sublimation, which is more positive. So the classic example that we would give now of Freud's sublimation in terms of aggression would be, there's a boy who's from the street and he's very violent and likes to beat people up. He can go and join a gang, or he can go to a boxing gym and become a famous.
That's right. Yeah.
And what's more, in the process, learn how not to punch everybody's head in, only to punch these people's heads in. And that's called sublimation. And you might...
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, you might argue.
And the same thing happens, the same arguments around organised sports, for example, and team sports are also part of sublimation and all that sort of stuff, and controlled aggression. Interesting, though, thinking about, it sounds obvious when we start talking about traumatized young men from the streets. How does it go to young men who are not from the streets, though? What was the insight you got there about what was going on for them that was similar and you saw this was going to work for them?
Well, hilariously, given everybody's opinions about it, exactly the same. Right. So it's no different whatsoever. Just because they're not roaming around, at risk of getting themselves a life sentence, it doesn't mean that they're not full of aggression. So that aggression would just be turned inwards into family, lots of domestic violence against their parents and things like that. So of course, men aren't more civilized because they're middle class. This is not how it is. It's just they do it differently. So we were dealing with exactly the same antisocial behaviors from affluent kids or kids from affluent families as we were. And these were young men. We didn't treat under 18-year-olds. It was 18 to 25, that program. So no, exactly the same. And they had...
You also found something really fascinating, which I'd never heard of before, but this idea that a certain amount of aggression through fighting actually allows young men, and maybe all men, to bond. And we've all come across that notion, but you actually researched it quite a lot. Can you tell me a bit about what's going on in those situations?
In mammals, or higher mammals, sort of rats will have the same response as humans. Young male rats and young male humans have they bond more closely when they're in the environment or close to potential predators. So it's to do with predators. So what you want when you're working with young men is a looming predator. That's very good at getting them to stop messing around and to start hugging each other and touching each other and supporting each other and fighting when necessary. They're fighting their way out of it and finding solutions. So in other words, the presence, so with rats, it was the odor of cats caused them to hug each other more and work together better. So the predator in that sense would be the older men who are running the boxing club.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah.
Black belts on the mat who are doing jiu-jitsu are going to break your arm, but who are sublimating. So they're not going to break your arm. They're just going to nearly break your arm because they're in control. So those senior males, if you like, I used to call them silverback males. You need silverback males around, and then the boys hug and touch, and they literally do it. Or another example, there's a Muay Thai fight coming up. One of them's training for a fight. So there's a big danger and a pressurizing situation looming. There's a war looming. And they're coming closer together. And they literally do hug and touch each other more. It's hilarious. When they're slightly in danger or there's a slight threat around, they come closer together. All the nonsense stops and they focus more. So what you need to do is kind of create that threat, sublimated, controlled threat. And then you start to get better behavior out of antisocial young men.
Yeah, great. That's a fantastic explanation. I was really sort of touched when I remember when you first presented that, and I went, hey, that's right. Well done. You've got it. You also combine that, and I know you do that in your own sort of life practice as part of your own recovery. You also combine that with some pretty sort of radical use of meditation and Eastern practice. So tell us about that, because I mean, you are classically the person who will sit and meditate for sort of 10 hours without moving or flinching. And you told a fantastic story once about having a fly on your nose and sort of having to meditate with that there for a whole day. But tell us about what's going on in meditation as you understand it and why it's appropriate to use.
Well, I was never that interested in Buddhism before I came to Thailand. So I think I'm a good example, really, because I'm not one of those kind of backpacker types, hippie types, and that's not me. So obviously I've been in Thailand 11 years now. I've ran my businesses here. I'm married to a Thai. So I got exposed to Buddhism through it just literally being in my community. Me thinking I need to use this and understand this. And so Vipassana is, obviously, you hear that word a lot, mindfulness these days. Well, Vipassana is the type of Buddhism that is prevalent in Thailand, Laos, Burma. It's not China, Korea, Japan. That is a different type of Buddhism. That's Mahayana Buddhism that doesn't particularly practice mindfulness meditation. They practice concentration meditation. So things like doing mantras, for example. They don't do that in Southeast Asia. They have mindfulness or Vipassana. So that's what I learned through going on retreat in the local temple where my then girlfriend took me for sort of calming purposes, because I was very pressurized as a busy executive by that point, effectively. And yeah, in a Vipassana retreat, you will, in a Thai temple, you will get up at 4 when the monks are chanting, and you will find at that time in the morning, cold patch of concrete, and you will go cross-legged on that patch of concrete for rounds, what we call rounds. So you'll sit for half an hour, and then you'll get up and do what they call walking meditation. So they walk and meditate as well in Thailand. So you walk very, very slowly, taking note of how your feet touch the floor and repeating, right foot goes thus, left foot goes thus as you're walking inside your mind, and then sitting down again. And those rounds go on for half-hour periods for the entire day until 10 p.m. at night, apart from some soup at maybe 8 a.m. So that's how I learned it. I had various levels of success in the temple. The first retreat, I couldn't hack more than 4 or 5 days. And the abbot there, who I knew because he'd been very kind when we set up the cabin and come and bless the business, because it was a people business. And in Buddhism, it's important to have what they call right livelihood. So you shouldn't probably not sell alcohol and things like that if you're a devout Buddhist. So a rehab was the sort of thing that he got behind, and he came and blessed the business. So I'd stayed in touch with him, and he was very mindful of my mental health and helpful when I used to go on retreat, and he used to take time out to talk to me. And so that's how I learned it. And when you get things like pain or discomfort, which of course you do immediately as soon as you start meditating, all of the I mean, those are your friends. That fly that lands on your nose and drives you nearly insane. You can't just be like hurriedly scratching it off your nose. That's what Vipassana is all about. It's all about getting a pain or an itch or an annoyance or something that you want to immediately eradicate, and not immediately eradicating it, learning to live with it. And of course, there are huge parallels here with addiction, with cravings. So we now use urge surfing and techniques like this in addiction, where you learn to sit and watch your cravings and almost go in, not into them, but observe them. In the same way that you would pain. So obviously mindfulness is also indicated for pain management now as well.
Yes, so, absolutely, yeah.
So being here in Thailand, obviously we had to bring this into our treatment system. So when the cabin was full swing in the mid 2010s, we had, teams of monks coming from the local temples to coach meditation. So we had the Muay Thai boxing going on, then we had the legit teachers of Vipassana straight from the tradition coming in. And people who went through that treatment system, they were very lucky, really, because that's not available.
Well, Vipassana itself is a form of addiction treatment standalone, and helps a lot of people, and they don't need to do anything else other than that. So because of that mindful approach around sort of not acting on thoughts and feelings, but sort of becoming interested in them and being able to sort of observe yourself. And it's also now increasingly in sort of, I'm not sure if you used it in this way, but sort of in terms of trauma treatment as well, and the capacity to observe and sort of manage that aspects of split off aspects of self. Were you involved in that? Are you involved in that as well?
Yeah, I mean, one of our guys at the cabin, Rory, was really responsible for driving the trauma program. So I built the basic program, and then Rory had built the trauma program in the mid 2010s when we realized that we had to have a program specifically for that. And it's both, really, because as our Thai psychiatrist told us, with people who are potentially psychotic. So for your listeners, that means not in touch with reality. It doesn't mean wandering around with an axe, wants to kill everybody. It means, perhaps delusional, not quite in touch with reality. If we had clients, say, who'd been abusing stimulants like meth heavily, that might still be hanging over them. And you have to be a bit careful with meditation with people who are in that state. It can trigger psychosis. So there's that to bear in mind. But on the other hand, with people who've got significant trauma, you can't just do talk therapy. In fact, they might start going back into it, and there's a re-traumatization happens when they start. So that's where the idea that a body-based therapy is used to help people learn how to manipulate their nervous system. In other words, calm down by doing something themselves. So learning sort of counting techniques or very simple body scan techniques, for example, body scanners, which is actually traditionally Burmese style of Vipassana. So sweeping, they call it in Burma. Start from the top of your head and you work down to your feet, sort of turning off your body parts, if you like, and relaxing them. So it is really the main tool in people who've got hyper aroused nervous systems. In other words, people who had shocking events that they're still to some extent stuck in. They really must learn some way of ramping down the nervous system, because that's where the illness is, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And it's also, I mean, even if people haven't had the objective life experiences, the fact that you're shoving loads of toxic chemicals into yourself will simulate those experiences neurologically and emotionally. So it's traumatic what you do to yourself when you're an addict, without even adding in life experiences. And if you're sort of dealing with addiction and you're having to meet people who are quite dangerous, you can also be involved in quite dangerous things in that sense as well. So even without, say, early childhood trauma, if you're going to be an active addict, it's quite a dangerous lifestyle choice, to be honest. And I don't think I've met anybody who's had a long-term addiction who hasn't then developed some sort of traumatic response to it itself, in and of itself. So these things, I think, and the caveats around psychosis, I think, are really important. And that just brings in the other elements of addiction treatment, which is the medical intervention. So the use of antipsychotics and the use of proper psychiatry, medically based psychiatric interventions are absolutely crucial, as are, coming back to the early bit of your story, I think medically assisted treatment, full stop. I mean, I believe in, the use of medication in opiate addiction treatment long term if people want to. If that's what keeps them off the streets and doing something really dangerous to themselves, then that's fine, absolutely. And it saves lives. So there's all that side, but we're not really going to go into it because I'm not a psychiatrist and you're not. But I think that's there and people sort of need to be aware of it. I guess the broad conversation that we're having is how we get people into having a good life again and moving into and giving them tools and resources that they can then take with them into the real world, as it were, away from the cosseted world of us giving them sort of lots of support and treatment, and then practical skills for living a life. But it's that essential lifestyle change.
Yes.
Yeah. And so that's, it seems to me, is what you've always been trying to achieve. If we think about addiction and trauma, mental illness, as we adapt to the chronic problem as a way of trying to cope with it and survive it. And those adaptations actually reinforce the problem rather than resolve it. And so we need to teach people how to resolve the issues and get into a healthier lifestyle, which I know is very important to you, that whole idea of transformation into healthy lifestyles. I mean, you live it, but you're also very much involved in it at the moment, I think, as well, aren't you?
Yes, and other people are key. You know, I mean, you have to have that ingredient. You have to kind of rejoin the human race in terms of not ending the isolation. And that can almost be tougher work, like making friends and joining clubs or having mentors and coaches in the skills that you want to learn, perhaps the physical skills, if you're talking about turning your body back on. Other people are going to be key to that. You can't really do it on your own. The temptation will be, say, to become a runner or somebody. You see it all the time. You know, I'm not an alcoholic anymore. I'm going to become an ultra endurance runner, and off there are for 20 hours at a time in the hills.
That's right. With the partner going, "Where are you?"
I mean, the very first extreme sport, if you like, that I got into in recovery was running, because I could do it on my own. And I didn't have to deal with these annoying things called other people. And I wondered why I was kind of dry drunk, as it were, which is a real thing, you know. So the idea that addiction is an illness that precedes the drug use. So, you know, in many, not all cases, but in many cases it does. And we don't actually understand it very well, but clearly there's something going on. People have the same damn symptoms before, during, and after. So, you know, I think this will feed into something that you wanted to talk about. I'd look at addiction as a chronic illness. Now, we don't have the words disease, illness. I don't really care about the words. It's a condition, right? But whatever it is chronic. So in medical terminology, that would mean not curable or very unlikely to be cured. So the symptoms linger horribly with chronic illnesses. And chronic illnesses are the biggest killers today, whereas once we died communicable illnesses like cholera, you know, waterborne diseases, now we die at our own hand. And on paper, it looks like we die of heart disease, cancers of the lungs, bronchus, trachea, smoking-related cancers, and so on. But 5 of the top 10 leading causes of death globally are chronic, non-communicable illnesses. So we don't catch them from other people, we cause them by our lifestyle. So they're also called lifestyle illnesses. So I see addiction as a chronic illness that causes a lot of those. So really, most medical bodies would not put it this way, but I would put it to people that addiction is actually behind the world's, you know, at least 4 or 5 of the world's leading causes of death. It's smoking that kills people of lung cancers, number 3 killer in the world. So it's not lung cancer as such, is it? It's smoking. And why do we need to smoke? Well, because we are unrewarded, living unmeaningful lives, and we don't have enough midbrain dopamine. So this is where we're at when we're talking about how to help people live healthier lives. It's a global thing. It's a public health thing, as you often say. Perhaps we need to take a bigger look at it, you know, try and look at it from a wider perspective.
And it's interesting, I think now is the time to be talking in public health terms about this. I tend to see addiction as public health, as a public health issue. And, you know, in the UK it's been moved into Public Health England from the National Treatment Agency, which is a recognition of it. It's a recognition that it's a chronic illness, as you say, or chronic condition, sort of so that we don't trigger people into saying sort of that hairy old debate that's boring. There's a chronic conditions, you're correct, are unlikely to be treated to the point where they don't exist. It really depends on the scale, as you've said before, where people are. So the way I think about it is this: it's sort of, there's these epigenetic possibilities in us, there's these possibilities within us, and what we do in the world switches them on or not. Once they're on, they're not going off. You've then got a choice, haven't you? A bit like a dimmer switch on a light. You've got a choice about how much you turn it up. The further you turn it up, it's never going back, really. It's going to be there. And the volume or the level to which you turn it up indicates the level to which you have to adapt to that permanently. Yes. The sooner you get it, the better is which is why it's a public health issue. And I think you're right. At the moment, we have what we call a deficit-based healthcare system. So you get services and attention because you have an illness.
Mhm.
And we reward illness literally because of it. So and we created a multi-billion-dollar industry around the globe, and I would include addiction treatment within that, which rewards illness.
Yes.
And does not reward health. Now, interestingly for me, you're sort of working on something at the moment which is going the opposite direction, which I'm sort of philosophically all on board with. So tell us a bit about that, if you don't mind, Alastair.
Yeah, well, post rehabs, if you like, having run rehabs for many years, and I'm kind of learned a lot doing that. And I started to have more of a public health outlook, as you say, thinking there's got to be a tech solution for this global health problem. You know, as you say, addiction isn't going away. It is a dimmer switch. I think it's important people understand it can be treated, but it can't necessarily be cured. So I always liken it to diabetes. You know, you have a choice. And if you live a great lifestyle, healthy lifestyle, and take your meds properly, you might, maybe not, but you might almost certainly with addiction get into the space where you think, I'm glad I've got this, because this made me the exceptional version of myself because I had no.
Yeah.
So that's the way, you know, think of a diabetic who chooses to become an Ironman.
I think the way I see it, Ali, I mean, I'm not suggesting it can't be helped. I mean, I think the point is that it can be treated, and the way it can be treated is there are set ways of treating it, including peer support and medical intervention, psychological intervention, physical intervention, etc. But it's that thing of the transformation of something from chronic controlling and reinforcing in terms of responses, the negative reinforcing of the need to be ill because our treatment models value you when you turn up in crisis.
Yes,
and
so,
it's that sort of thing. Without a doubt, it can be helped, and I don't have any issue with that. But it's sort of more about this other issue about how we are rewarding illness. And you do have to be slightly exceptional to move out of that into what I would call maybe recovery models, for example, which is, but you've got some interesting ideas, I think, on how we might think about promoting this recovery notion a bit broader, I think.
There are tech solutions to it to help that process along. So you talk about reward, you're quite right. The public health system sometimes rewards illness. They're not meaning to do it, but it does do it. So what we know is that reward platforms, what are called reward platforms, which I'll explain in a minute, are going to become foundational technology in health. Now, reward platforms is pretty self-explanatory. They are platforms on which you are rewarded for doing things. So with what we have now, blockchain. So one of the new technologies that people might have heard of is blockchain. It's the kind of tech behind cryptocurrencies, but it has many other applications. So it's essentially just a ledger where people can pay each other without having a middleman necessarily, like a government or whatever it is. So when I began to look at global causes of death and realized, like a lot of other people have, that addiction's behind a lot of these, then I started to look into the literature, and I found that, strangely, when you reward people for making behavioral changes, they tend to do it more. Now, that makes sense from what we know about addiction, for example, because you don't treat addiction by just stopping the bad reward. You treat addiction by getting rid of the reward and putting a more meaningful and healthier place. Now, whether that's like becoming spiritual and getting into a spiritual lifestyle, or running, or working with others, you know, being around others a lot, all of those things are sort of dopaminergic actions. You know, they medicate your midbrain hedonic tone. So, but so does money. And money is actually neutral. So pregnant mothers, for example, who smoke are 3 times more likely to stop smoking if they're paid to do so. People on methadone maintenance programs are more likely to stay on their methadone maintenance programs rather than use street heroin when they're paid to do so. People lose more weight when they're paid, and they keep the weight off for longer when they're paid. So it's one of those arguments that's very controversial. It's effectively what's called effective altruism. So it's, if it's good, or if it works, then do it. But people say, oh, you shouldn't reward people for things like that. My view is we'll do whatever works, especially when it's a problem this pronounced. So what we came up with was to develop a blockchain called Elevate, which will ultimately have its own cryptocurrency. And the reason we need blockchains so as people can get paid in the millions. So if, for example, they had a very simple example, if they have a lifestyle illness, then perhaps mild physical exercise is indicated. So then they have a pedometer on their phone. And when they do a certain amount of mileage, they get a certain amount of Elevate cryptocurrency, which they can spend in ecosystems like a group of shops that sell athletic gear, or perhaps books and things like that, or perhaps even just convert into cash once we have crypto
perhaps just buy food, because we're talking about people that need the money, right?
So that was the idea, and then you can extrapolate that out. So what it does need is large key stakeholders. So that's where we're in discussions at the moment with large bodies. Say, for example, an entire state in the US, their probation service doesn't want all of their released offenders reoffending. And now we know that drugs and alcohol are the main driver of reoffending. So let's say they have a VidCam breathalyzer that they have to blow into every day, but now they're getting paid for it.
Yeah.
So if they're twice as likely to stay sober because they're being paid for it, then they're not running over kids in their car.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things is that what's interesting about what you're saying is the sort of neurological substrates that are going on. That this approach is actually sort of producing healthy responses within the brain that are pro-social responses rather than the antisocial responses. Because money has come to mean, can be, but it is a substitute, a sublimation, if you like, for subsistence or survival.
Yes.
And it's one of the main important survival mechanisms. And we know that a lot of these unhealthy behaviors around addiction, for example, are sort of survival instincts that have been hijacked. And we need to sort of, often the work is to bring them back into healthier, as you say, instinctual responses. And it seems to me that this sort of understanding, just for people who might be going, but that doesn't sound right. What we've got already is a system of perverse incentivization, where we have they call it in economics, they call it the cobra effect. I'll just briefly explain it so people understand it. The British Raj had a problem with cobras in India. So they decided the way to get rid of cobras was to pay people to kill them. Okay, makes sense. What happened was they sort of local people did kill off all the cobras. They ran out, but they wanted to keep making the money. So they started farming them. And then they killed the farmed cobras and bring them in and make money. And then the sort of people who were paying for this when suddenly cottoned on and said, we're not doing that anymore. And then so they released all the cobras that they'd farmed, and there was 10 times as many cobras as before. These types of incentives exist in the world. And what you're talking about, it seems to me, is that we understand that process and we stop having perverse incentives. And we start having more rational, thought through incentives. And what could be more incentivizing than meeting somebody's basic need to survive and rewarding them to survive in a healthy way? I mean, I don't see how anybody could object to that.
Yes, and I mean, it's got multiple applications. So you could have it for unplugged and digital detox. You can have it for medication compliance, because these days it's easy to get, a lot of hardware. For example, pinprick that shows that you've taken your medication.
Absolutely.
A health provider, billions of dollars over the long term. So this is for both parties. It's for key stakeholders like National Health Services, who would buy the currency and reward their citizens, policyholders, customers with that reward in exchange for a change in their behavioral health. And it's coming anyway. But the difference would be this: for example, in car insurance, they call it telematics, and you've got a black box in your car. You can't do bad things anymore. There will come the point where with driving you cannot offend. It will be impossible, because you're being monitored. Everything that you're doing is being monitored. Now, so you can kind of see the Orwellian overtones of that, right? But so the thing is to get in at the beginning and make this work properly. And we know that people, say, who are addicted, for example, they won't respond to a reduction in their policy at the end of the year. What they want is a regular reward many times through the day. So that's
right. Yeah.
Feeds them little slugs of dopamine.
Absolutely.
Kind of
anticipation doesn't work with addicts. They're not well known for holding on to anticipation.
And perhaps there's an analogy here. Perhaps we need to gamify our life when we're.
That is where we're going. I mean, I think the gamification of health services is the next big revolution, and sort of on these online platforms that will sort of provide these reward mechanisms. And I think money is a sensible reward mechanism to think about, because we're going to pay for it one way or the other. And it seems to me eminently sensible to pay to be healthy rather than pay to be ill. And at the moment, we're paying people to be ill. Unfortunately, we've come to the end. It's been an hour. I mean, that's extraordinary. Thank you. And what are these sort of websites where people can get hold of you and get hold of what you're doing? And then we'll put them out there, so share them.
My name, really. So alastairmordey.com is probably the best place to go. That's most of my websites and businesses on there, and most of my social media is exactly the same: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc.
Yeah, so get hold of Ali. He's a nice guy. Hopefully I'll get to see you again one day, real world, Ali, and we'll have a coffee somewhere where there's bird shit and stuff like that in London somewhere, and or maybe I'll come out to Thailand, and I won't sit and meditate with you for 10 hours. I'm just not that sort of person, right? But do something else fun. Really lovely to have you on this evening, and really interesting conversation as always from you, sort of somebody who thinks deeply about what's going on, and working with people with complex motivations to help them move out of chronic problems. So thanks for that. Really insightful evening with you. Going to say goodbye, folks, and I'll see you all next week. Ali, you just stay with us as we sort of just close down the show, and thanks again.